Hello and welcome to this GCSE German presentation with Carlam Cymru. This presentation focuses on das Perfekt or the perfect tense. So this is the most commonly used form of the past tense in German, which is used when talking about something in the past which must be a completed action. So the action cannot be ongoing, it must have been completed. It is mostly used in spoken and informal language. So before we look in more detail at das Perfekt, I would like to take a second just to look at how in English we often have more than one way of expressing a certain tense. So for example, in the present tense, we could say in English, I play, I am playing, or I do play. But those three forms in German would all translate to ich spiele. So the closest version in the English to ich spiele would probably be I play because of the number of words in that phrase. So if we look at the past tense here, in English we could say I played, and ed at the end of a verb is a very common way of changing an infinitive into a past tense verb. We could also say I have played or I did play. So all of those three forms in German would translate to one singular phrase which we will look at today. And the I have played in English is the closest equivalent. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will be looking at I have played as the English equivalent to the German because of the number of words and the way the sentence is structured. So let's look at our first example. So in English, we would probably be most likely to use I played football as a phrase, as a sentence. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to add in have, because this corresponds more closely to what we have in German. So have here is an example of an auxiliary or a helping verb. It doesn't add any more context or information to the sentence, it just helps us to create the past tense. We also have played, which we call the past participle. And in English, we often create the past participle with ed at the end of the verb, but not always. So in German, we must keep the auxiliary verb, the helping verb, and we must have a past participle. But in English, we don't always have to have this helping verb. So if we look at the German equivalent, ich habe is I have. So habe here is the auxiliary or the helping verb, which translates perfectly from the English. And then we have the past participle at the end of the sentence. So word order is important here. The Fußball goes in the centre, so that the past participle then goes to the end of the phrase or sentence. There are, of course, always exceptions to the rules, and the main exception in the past tense in German is when using verbs which indicate movement, generally speaking, movement from one place to another. So, for example, if we wanted to use a sentence similar to this one, I went to school, adding in have as my auxiliary verb as we did in the previous slide, and keeping my past participle. It's changed from went in the original sentence because of English grammar rules, but we do still have our auxiliary verb have, and we have our past participle. But because we are now indicating movement from one place to another, I am not able to use haben in the German sentence as my auxiliary verb. It needs to change to sein, to be. So, ich bin is at the beginning of the sentence with the auxiliary verb. The rest of the sentence, zur Schule, before the past participle in its place at the end of the phrase or sentence. So when indicating movement from one place to another, the auxiliary verb becomes sein. So when you are beginning to build your past tense sentence, your first task is to determine which of the helping or auxiliary verbs you need to be using. This can either be haben or sein. If there is no movement involved in the verb in question, so if you are not travelling anywhere, for example, you will use haben. So first of all, you need to conjugate haben in the present tense. Ich habe, du hast, sie, es hat, wir haben, ihr habt, and sie haben. So haben is used for most of your verbs. So for example, playing, cooking, reading, speaking, listening, eating, and drinking. Okay, so even though there is movement involved sometimes with playing, you're not travelling anywhere. Okay, there is no sense of movement in that sense. On the flip side, when you are talking about movement, if you're talking about moving from one place to another, then you will use sein. Ich bin, du bist, sie, es ist, wir sind, ihr seid, and sie sind. So sein is used for verbs such as travelling, flying, walking, running, swimming, going, so going to school for example, and even changing of state, for example, to be born or even then to die as well, change of state. Once you have determined which of the auxiliary verbs, haben or sein, you should be using with the verb in question, the second step to create your past tense sentence is to create the past participle itself. So in English, many of our past participles end with ed, but not all of them. So for example, you wouldn't say I righted, you would say I wrote. You wouldn't say I singed, you would say I sung. So obviously as well in German then we do have these exceptions. We have weak verbs and strong verbs in German. Generally speaking, weak verbs follow a regular conjugation pattern. They follow the same rules, but strong verbs don't. So unfortunately, strong verbs will have to be learned separately. But let's look at weak verbs first of all. So these will generally all follow the exact same pattern as I'm going to show you now. So we've looked at spielen a couple of times today already. Spielen, to play. So if we wanted to create the past tense played from the verb spielen, there are a few steps to take. First of all, we remove the en at the end of the infinitive, which leaves us with the stem spiel. We then add ge to the beginning and t to the end. This gives us gespielt, played. And this is the format which most then verbs in German will take. The weak verbs will follow this pattern. So if we put that pattern then with the other verbs I have as examples, for example, hören, to hear, we remove the en, we add ge to the beginning and t to the end. We now have gehört, listened or heard. Kaufen, to buy, we remove the en at the end, we add ge, we add t, which gives us gekauft, which is an irregular verb in English. We would say bought, not buyed. And the last example of a weak verb, haben itself, so to have, we remove the en, we add the ge to the beginning and the t to the end, so gehabt. All of those verbs would use haben as their auxiliary verb in the past tense. Let's now look at strong verbs. Some of them will change more than others. Some of them keep some of the characteristics of weak verbs. Others will change more significantly. So if we look at sehen to begin with, to see. If you followed the pattern that I have just explained, you would remove the en, you would add ge at the beginning and a t at the end. Unfortunately, that's not the way sehen performs in the past tense. We add ge to the beginning of the infinitive and we create gesehen. So I you would say, if you were using me as an example, you would say, ich habe gesehen. I saw. Next one, sprechen, to speak. This changes its vowel in the centre to an O. So we now have gesprochen. So that's slightly more of a change from the infinitive. But again, refusing to keep that T at the end of most past participles. Gehen, to go, and you would use sein here as your auxiliary verb because there is movement involved. This changes quite significantly. Gegangen. So if you wanted to say, I went, ich bin gegangen. So sein here is the auxiliary verb because of that movement. Schreiben, to write, changes to geschrieben. So notice the change in vowels in the centre. Geschrieben. Schwimmen, again, there is movement involved here. So you would use sein as your auxiliary verb. And this again changes its vowel. Geschwommen is your past participle. So I went swimming, or I swam. Ich bin geschwommen. And the final example here, bleiben, which means to stay, would change to geblieben. So again here you have that change in the vowel in the middle. Bleiben also uses sein as its auxiliary verb because even though there is no movement involved in the verb to stay, the fact that there is no movement involved is actually something to do with movement. It's quite confusing. So bleiben would use sein here as its auxiliary verb. Now let's look at word order. So as we know in German, word order is very, very important. If we take a very simple sentence that we have now managed to construct in the past tense. So if we wanted to say that I played, you would say ich habe gespielt. So we've used haben as our auxiliary verb because there is no movement involved, and we've used spielen as our main verb, but we've changed it to our past participle, gespielt. If we wanted to add in what exactly we played, we have to put that before we put the past participle. The past participle goes to the end of the phrase or sentence. So ich habe Tennis gespielt. So that's different English where we would say I played tennis, and tennis would come after the past participle. In German, the past participle is at the end. So ich habe Tennis gespielt. If we then use an example with sein as the auxiliary verb, ich bin gegangen, so I went. If we wanted to add in a place, where did we go? Or where did I go? We would say, ich bin, for example, zur Schule gegangen. So again, the past participle is shifted to the end of the phrase or sentence. You may have come across the rule time, manner, place. So this is the order in which things are placed in a German sentence. So if you wanted to say when something happened, how something happened, which includes as well with whom you did the action, and where the action took place, this is the order you would follow. So you would never say where something happened before you said when it happened. This is true in the present tense as well. So if we use this as an example, so we have letztes Wochenende habe ich mit meinen Freunden im Park Tennis gespielt. So we're using our first example on the screen here, ich habe gespielt. You can see all of those words in that sentence, but you can see that there is more information. So we begin with when it happened. So I've used letztes Wochenende, so last weekend. Because we've added that to the beginning of our sentence, the verb then becomes our second idea. So the auxiliary verb here is our second idea, which comes next. We then add in the manner, which includes with whom something happened. So we've added in mit meinen Freunden. Then we say where, so the place where it happened, so im Park. Then we add the rest of the sentence with the past participle at the end. So you would never really swap around that information. You would never put with your friends before you put last weekend. Let's look at another example using sein as our auxiliary verb. So in this second example, we had ich bin gegangen and ich bin zur Schule gegangen. So we've added in where we went, or where I went. So if we add in time, manner, place once again as our rule of when things are placed in a sentence, we would have gestern, so yesterday, bin ich mit dem Fahrrad schnell zur Schule gegangen. So in this example, again, we have the time at the beginning of the sentence. Because we have that, we then have to have our verb as the second idea. So the auxiliary verb bin becomes the second idea. We now need manner. But in this example, I've put two examples of how something was done. So I've put mit dem Fahrrad, so on my bike, and schnell, so quickly. So that's two examples of manner. Then we say where, zur Schule, and then again our past participle at the end. But what happens in a mixed sentence, meaning that you have more than one past participle being used in the same sentence? So for example, if you have a sentence which uses the auxiliary verb haben more than once. So in this example, we have gehört and gesprochen as past participles. They both use haben as their auxiliary verb. So you could have a sentence similar to this one. Ich habe Musik gehört und habe danach mit meinen Freunden gesprochen. So I listened to music and then I spoke with my friends. In this example, I have ich habe and then I have habe for the second past participle again. You don't really need that second habe because they both use the same auxiliary verb. So the ich habe at the beginning is being used for both of the past participles. The same goes if you are using sein. So in this example, we have ich bin nach Hause gefahren und bin wandern gegangen. So we have gefahren and gegangen, both of which use ich bin, so sein, as their auxiliary verbs. So in the same way, you don't really need that second bin, because the first ich bin is acting for the gefahren and also for the gegangen. But what happens if you have a mixture, if you have a haben and a sein verb being used? This is an example. So if we said, ich bin nach Hause gegangen und habe gelesen. The ich bin is being used for the gegangen past participle, which can't then also be used for gelesen, to read at the end. So you cannot use ich bin gegangen and then use gelesen without the habe in front of it. So that's an example of a true mixed sentence. So on this slide, I have included some exercises for you to practice creating the past tense in German. So the first group include regular verbs using haben as the auxiliary verb. So conjugating the verb haben depending on the pronoun at the beginning of the sentence, and then creating the past participle in the way I showed in this presentation by removing the en at the end of the infinitive, adding the ge at the beginning and the t at the end to create the past participle. Then we have irregular verbs using haben. So remember, these don't follow the usual pattern of adding ge at the beginning and a t at the end. So these are ones that you may need to look up in a dictionary. And then we have verbs taking sein, which are usually verbs of motion, as we've seen in this presentation. So I encourage you now to press pause on this video, try and complete this task as well as you can, and then on the next screen we will have the answers. So here are the answers to this activity. Very much hope that you managed to create these sentences correctly and that you're now feeling more confident in using das Perfekt in German. And to finish, here is the website address for Carlam Cymru, which includes a variety and a wealth of videos and revision resources to help you across your subjects in GCSE, AS and A-level examinations. All that's left for me to do is to wish you all viel Glück, good luck everybody in your examinations.